My name is Jessica Rowland, and I'm the Senior Inclusion Specialist at the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, based in New York. So today's focus is actually on building understanding on the links between faith, climate, and conflict. And so we'll be hearing from a lot of our guest presenters and fireside chats, and then going back to everyone in the room on how you all are actually doing this in your work, as many of you are climate emergency activists and practitioners. And so we're really excited to be able to hear how you all are addressing climate emergencies in your various contexts. We're going to hear from a very wide range of perspectives and regions to see how people are actually working with others, whether it be policymakers or those in your local communities, to be able to tackle this multifaceted problem. I will turn it to our first guest presenter, Shiraz Ahmed, who is the International Director for Faith for Our Planet, who the network has been working with, I think now for the past year, on their various regional consultations and youth fellowship program, which I'm sure we'll hear all about from Shiraz. So without further ado, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Jessica. And I'm really excited to be here. So I'll start off by saying a little bit about myself, about FFOP, what we do. So Faith for Our Planet is a global NGO dedicated to essentially building the capacity of faith leaders around the world to become climate leaders. For us, this was a massive deficit in global climate action efforts. 84% of the planet identify with faith, and faith leaders tend to have tremendous moral authority. So the role of faith leaders and faith communities in being able to help transcend differences in building a common set of values aligned to those that the global climate action movement is driven by, in helping coordinate efforts when it comes to climate resiliency in grassroots communities around the world, is pretty invaluable. And we go further, actually. We say it's absolutely necessary. And yet there is a palpable deficit of engagement, at least with some depth, with faith leaders around the world. Often it tends to be through expressions of sentiment, a expression of values, which is very powerful. But we feel that faith leaders can play a really notable role in climate action and in this particular issue. So I won't dwell on this too much. This is our team. Some of you will have met with different members of our team. We are an organization whose seed sponsorship has come from the Muslim World League. They are the world's largest Islamic NGO based in Mecca and have done a tremendous amount of work in the interfaith space in the last 5 to 7 years. And we are really leveraging those networks and relationships in our work. That is somewhat reflected in our global directorship, which is continuing to grow. So we have directors from Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, ASEAN region, South Asia, and North America. So without much further ado, I want to speak a little bit about the unique potential of faith leaders in climate action. I'm sure we all know this already, climate change intersects with many, perhaps all global crises. Climate change can destabilize entire regions, have horrible effects on natural resources, food insecurity, water insecurity. And so it's really difficult to ring fence the impact of climate change. That said, there is a powerful role that faith leaders can play and faith populations. 84% of the world's population identifies with a faith group. And throughout history, we have seen faith leaders really be central to social justice, the issue of social justice. particularly in countries today that are on the front lines of climate change, that is still very much the case. As I'll go on to mention, FFOP has delivered workshops and training for faith leaders in Gambia, Pakistan. It's looking to do more in countries like Bangladesh, in the ASEAN region. And in many of those countries, the role of faith leaders as society's moral leaders is still very, very much maintained. So the climate crisis is, and I just want to take a moment to just dwell on some of these points a little longer than I would than on some of the other slides, because they're central to what FFOP's mandate and mission is. There is really no absence or lack of financial resources to address the climate crisis. We don't really have a huge deficit when it comes to technology, where the technology is evolving, clean energy is becoming far more accessible. But it's an area where we've made huge strides. And what's really lacking is willpower at a global level and at all levels, from ordinary people to our policymakers to the society's moral and values-based leaders. There is a general lack of willpower, and that's where faith leadership can play a tremendous role, because faith still, for so many people in the world, offers this incredible ability to create a unifying vision based on the values that people across the global south and beyond hold the dearest. So on that basis, there are a certain number of activities that FFOP delivers. We focus very much on creating a bridge between the world of secular climate science and faith leadership. I'll speak a little bit about this as we go on, but that really is one of our primary goals, is to make climate science accessible to faith leaders and to offer theological training to help faith leaders bridge science and faith, for them to see the alignment between scripture and climate consciousness. Certainly in countries like the UK, where I'm from, and in Europe, we're beginning to find that faith leaders are embracing that far more. But in our experience, when we've gone to other countries, that really clear, direct connection isn't as visceral as it could and should be. So there's a huge amount we do around capacity building, and it starts from a theological standpoint, but then very much melds into campaigning and capacity building skills, how to advocate for these issues, how to infuse climate language into sermons, for instance. So just to point out a few areas that we focus on. One, of course, is general awareness raising. FFOP does help faith leaders once those faith leaders are signed up, so to speak. They are absolutely of the belief that their faith values call them to engage in climate action. We work with them to help mobilize followers locally. We give them skills for climate advocacy. And I think there's a lot to be said about the role that faith leadership and faith-based organizations can play in communicating to the world of policy. So we, FFOP, will be delivering events increasingly now that interface with policy, so at the UN, but also at COP. And although there seems to be a willingness by policy makers to engage faith, the world of faith, there seems to be a real lack of understanding about how best to do that. In what ways can faith leaders play a notable role in climate action? We, FFOP, are working with faith leaders to come up with approaches and toolkits, really, for how to do that. I'll speak a little bit about our workshops. And an interesting one to talk about is the one we delivered in Pakistan, actually. It was, I think, our first climate literacy training workshop. What's particularly notable about Pakistan was we did it at the International Islamic University in Islamabad, which is a very prestigious religious academic institution. And we convened a number of religious leaders, but we also convened members of the more mainstream, you might say, secular climate science and climate civil society activist movements. That conversation was incredibly powerful. And what we found was that actually the faith leaders there completely understood right from the start that Islam has a very clear, powerful connection to the earth. As with, I think, not just the Abrahamic faiths, actually all faiths, mankind has a certain responsibility. They are stewards of the earth. So that was very much there. What was a big takeaway for us was that as the conversation progressed, what the faith leaders, some who were very senior, began to appreciate was urgency. The urgency with which action had to be taken. And that's where the climate science component came in. So a lot of the faith leaders were not fully aware, this was before the floods in Pakistan, but they were not acutely aware of how urgent it was that action be taken now, that we are at the 11th hour and that unless we take action, we are facing potentially irreversible catastrophe as a global community. And this is a conversation we are continuing to have with faith leaders, and we are looking to do more in Pakistan, but it was a shift in context and perspective that helped those faith leaders understand that there is a moral compulsion to have to act now and to have to act with great urgency. That was very powerful, and I think it speaks to how those interactions can help fill these very powerful gaps in understanding. Youth is also very important. So we have delivered a Youth Interfaith Fellowship program on climate change in our TP. It was very, very helpful here. And some of the people at this event actually were fellows on our Youth Fellowship program. So we have a big focus on engaging youth. We feel that's very much essential to ensuring there can be a shift in narrative and that we engage those members of our global community that have the biggest stake in this issue. It's worth speaking a little bit. So I'm going to circle back a little bit. On one of the previous slides, there was some mention of theological and scriptural literacy work, and I think there's a lot to be said here, especially when we're talking about issues like climate conflict and the way climate change intersects with major problems around the world. That often isn't made patently clear to not just faith leaders, but to a lot of us. Narrative building is very, very powerful. And as part of building that narrative, bringing faith leaders on board to get behind that narrative is absolutely essential. So one of our efforts that is ongoing, and we hope to have this completed in the next, say, just before COP, in the next 2 to 3 months, is a focus on how religious charitable giving, faith-based philanthropy can make a tangible difference for global climate financing. And to give you one example of this is an article that our chairman wrote about this in an article for the Toronto Star, I think last year. The zakat, the obligatory Islamic charitable tax that all Muslims must pay to the value of 5% of their wealth, that accrues something in the region of something like $700 billion to $1.3 trillion every year. And yet, very little of it goes towards climate projects. Part of the reason for that is there is a lack of understanding about how climate change will aggravate exponentially every criteria upon which zakat is paid. So whether it be homelessness, general destitution, food insecurity, water insecurity. Climate change will aggravate every single one of those. What we are trying to do in partnership with Duke and other academic institutions is bring faith leaders together to offer a theologically grounded narrative on why global religious philanthropy and charitable giving, whether it's individuals from the Church of England or the Catholic Church, Jewish communities, why there is absolutely a need, a moral imperative to focus somewhat on the impact of climate change, because it intersects with so many other global crises and challenges. We hope to showcase this quite possibly around the time of COP, which would be notable insofar as at every COP event there's always a massive deficit in financing. But I thought this would be a useful thought experiment, a case study for how faith leaders can play a notable role, not just in sharing, vocal support, but actually shifting theological thinking and cultural thinking and practices towards making tangible change. I'm very cognizant, by the way, that I have a limited amount of time. So in terms of what we're looking to do in future, we are looking to build out an academy that focuses on, that is a region-specific and faith-specific focus, and really training faith leaders to train other faith leaders. So create a train the trainers program. Again, primarily because faith leaders can play such a powerful role in mobilizing people, in shifting attitudes and perceptions. That is everything.
Thank you, Shiraz. And I know there's already some questions here in the chat if you want to try to look at them. But we've now been listening to the global perspective who Faith for Our Planet has been holding these regional broader consultations. But now we're going to go to the local level and hear from Marian Iketing, who is from the Sikor in Uganda. She's the gender focal person there, and how they contributed to localizing climate, peace, and security with a step-by-step guide for local peace builders. So we're going to hear more from Marian, and so I turn it to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. It's afternoon back here in Uganda. My name is Marian Iketing, like Jessica has already introduced me, and I am a gender focal person. I work with Center for Conflict Resolution, which is in Uganda, the eastern part of Africa. You're all welcome. It's sunny and warm right now. I'm going to share with you our experience at Center for Conflict Resolution, which is a non-governmental organization that is also referred to as civil society. We were working on a pilot project with support from UNDP on climate, the nexus between climate change, peace, and security, but also looking at the gender lens towards it. From Jessica's invitation to us to share with you what it was like for us, I'll share with you the process of localization, what it requires. You see, like now we'll talk about climate, peace, and security. We are speaking English, but when you go down to the community, you've got to bring the language lower to the level of the understanding of the people that we are working with. This project was piloted in northeastern Uganda in a district that is called Kabong. If you know the map of Uganda, if you drew it and looked at the part that has got the tip, that is how far it is. It's a semi-arid area, a pastoral community that is neighbored by South Sudan and also neighbored with Kenya. Depending on which way you're facing, you're either facing South Sudan or you're facing Kenya. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation to this, but you can, I'm sure you're able to look up these places. The fact that it is it's a semi-arid area, there are so many factors that play around, that play tricks on this particular community, and therefore they've got to adapt in one way or the other. So what we did as Center for Conflict Resolution was to look at the keywords. Look at the words climate, security, and peace, and then ask the people that the stakeholders we identified. And the stakeholders here that we identified were the lower local government, those that are directly concerned with this. For instance, the community development officer, we looked at the security, the person in charge of security. We looked at the natural resources officer. We also looked at the person in charge of, looking at the keywords: climate, security, and peace. Who is responsible for this? We even worked with security personnel. Those are the different stakeholders. And then the fact that the community is strongly rooted in culture. They believe so much in their leaders. We had to look for the local leadership as well. The peace, the chairpersons for the peace committees, we had to look for them as well. We had to look for women, because when war happens or when there's an instability, then when you're going to have the women affected. So we brought in the women also as stakeholders, so that as we were discussing peace and security, climate change, we asked them what their understanding was of these words. So whatever it is, we got the understanding, so that we are on the same page. As we spoke English, then they spoke the language that they interpreted those words in the language that they understood. That is part of localizing, as in bring it closer, simpler, and easier to the target community. Thereafter, we had to bring the lower local government and the community leaders, because these are two different arms. What the community leaders know and what the lower local government knows, sometimes the community leaders are ignored, or maybe not ignored, but underestimated. Their ability to interpret is not valued. So we had to bring these two together to actually understand each other and talk to each other. And then we asked the same question and said, when such and such a thing happens, what does it mean to you? So, for instance, in this particular area, the levels of insecurities, the use of small arms and light weapons is quite high. So what happens is we ask them, anytime you see that the enemies are coming to raid, they're cattle keepers. So their lifestyle is around cattle keeping, raiding cattle, going out to graze. So that means when climate changes, when it becomes dry, or when they see animals or birds migrating, then they know there's a sign that something not so good is going to happen. So we would ask them, so what are the signs? And they would tell us, when you see the birds go to this direction, then you know the weather is changing, and therefore it's a sign that our neighbors are coming in to share the limited resources with us. And then while we're at it, then you tell them, so how do you know that there's probably going to be a raid that is going to come in? They have their scientific traditional way of understanding how these things come in, different signs that show there's going to be trouble in this place. For instance, what they do is they get a goat, they give the elders cut the goat, and then the elders interpret the intestines. When the elders interpret the intestines, they tell you either there's good news here or there's bad news. And indeed, usually their information is accurate. It's rudimentary, but is accurate. They'll tell you the weather patterns. It's going to rain so heavily, as compared to the meteorological department. Meteorological department may read, and then the following day the story is different. But we witnessed it ourselves as SICO and said, okay, fine. Now we know this gap. We who have gone to school, either because of the knowledge basis that we are standing on, or our faith basis, which is Christianity. And usually when these raids also happen, there's a use of guns. So the question of looking at the organization that is holding this meeting together, we're looking at the interreligious, the faith section of it. In this particular area, or in Uganda in particular, to a certain extent, people believe in the religious leaders. People believe in the faith, in their faith. So what we would do, even as we are doing these things, we include the religious leaders. And one of our core advocates is actually a priest. He's a Catholic priest. So we use him to talk to the communities when he goes to church, and he's talking to them and telling them, you know what, I think it is important that we stop raiding each other. It is important that we stop killing ourselves. And when we have radio talk shows, we invite him. They listen to the religious leader because they believe he's speaking the gospel truth. So that is part of it. So one of the other signs that the community will notice that there's going to be trouble is, for instance, it's the young people who are energetic. And when they're going out to raid, what they do in a trading center, they'll buy all the donuts from the stalls. Once they see that kind of thing, then it's a sign they're going to go somewhere and they're going to raid and steal cows. And that means there's bound to be a retaliation. So everybody's feelers are open, and they know either they're going to retaliate or there's going to be a forced disarmament happening in this particular section of the country and stuff like that. So those are some of the things that happen to us. And what it means for us as Center for Conflict Resolution is that it helps us when we include everybody, when we include the lower leaders, the local government leaders, when we include the community members, when we include women, include faith-based organizations, we get to get a leaf from each one. For purposes of programming, then we know how do we program activities, how do we program projects to help us cause an impact in community and in society. Otherwise, we work in utopia. We can't just build up ideas from nowhere without engaging with the people. So that when you're coming to address an issue, you are on target. So what we also did was to get data collectors who are able to interact with the community members, and they collect information that is happening. They'll let you know whatever is within our means, then we can advise. If not, they can tell the local leadership, please come and address ABCD because this is going to happen. And so we facilitate them, give them notebooks, and then as they hand over the information on a monthly basis, they hand it over to us on a monthly basis for analysis, and then we can advise. Okay, 1 minute to go. So one of the challenges that we had was the information. There's nothing documented. It's important to document traditional indigenous knowledge systems and compare them with what we know best. So in a nutshell, that is really, really what we did in this particular project. And I believe if we had more funding, we'd expand our base of activity. Thank you very much, Jessica.
Thank you, Marian. I was just thinking before you even said about the lack of data, I was just thinking in my head of why, this would be so fascinating to document as documentaries go, maybe we can get some of the famous nature speakers to come and actually do the voiceover and actually get people's attention and awareness to be able to bring it to the local level. So yes, so we talked to Marian, who raised a lot of inclusion elements in some of the discussion points too about, the way that elders, for example, are monitoring young people before raids, or looking at the gender components of some of this localization work. So now that we have went from the perspective of Uganda, we're going to jump all the way to Bangladesh, and I'm going to turn it to my colleague Sanat, who is the General Secretary and CEO of Atisha Depankar Peace Trust Bangladesh. And I'm going to share his presentation for him to be able to talk about his experience and how they're tackling climate emergencies. I can share the PowerPoint, and I'll share in the chat the interfaith climate justice and regeneration training. I think it's really important that people know that about your upcoming consultations that you're doing and the training. And I'll make sure to leave your contact details in the chat. So just for everybody else's awareness of what Sanat is trying to introduce, they have developed a training on interfaith climate justice and regeneration. And it provides an overall information on root causes and impacts of climate from the ecological crisis with solutions. And it's really about trying to get support for participants at different levels in their community and in their personal lives, all the way to the national level on deepening mutual understanding, connectivity, and solidarity around addressing climate emergency. So I'm going to share this in the chat so everybody can kind of see what this training looks like and the upcoming trainings that are available online on Zoom. And if you have further questions about it, Sanat can reach out to you personally, but there's a lot of really good resources in this document, and I'll definitely share the PowerPoint as well. So we will go to the next part of the Community of Practice meeting, which is our youth-led and focused panel, and I will turn it to our moderator, Mustafa Abderman. He is the projects coordinator with Building Blocks for Peace Foundation. Mustafa, I will turn it to you to introduce your speakers.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Here in Nigeria is afternoon. I'm very grateful for giving this ample opportunity to moderate this fireside chat today on the thematic area building understanding on the links between faith, climate, and the conflict. So our speakers for today, we have Yusuf, Emily, and Brian. So these are the speakers for today. So I hope our speakers are ready. So as a young leaders addressing climate emergencies in your community, have you found that a unique opportunities in working youth faith actors and the communities in address conflict? What seems to work and not work in my experience?
Thank you so much, Mustafa, and thanks a lot for Jessica and the network and for all guests and speakers for giving me this opportunity and to hear from a young person from the Southern Mediterranean region. First of all, when it comes to the collaboration between religious institutions or faith actors and young people, I would like to highlight two main points that I think that it's really, really important to be addressed now. The first point, it's about the crisis of confidence and trust in religious institutions or even religious elders. There are many factors for this. For example, a phenomena like the Islamophobia, or I would replace this word with religious phobia, which means supporting and pushing the industry of creating the fairness and scareness of, if not only Islam, but also religions. Media plays a very important role in this aspect. And as a result of such a phenomena, young people now are less confident in these organizations and their values and their orders and their speeches, even in public meetings or conferences. The second problem is the growing isolation between youth and these religious institutions for many reasons. For example, the role that these organizations supposed to play last 2 decades or 3 decades was actually less compared with the role in the 19th or the 18th century. So the connections between these organizations or these institutions and young people is a bit limited from my perspective. Coming back, despite the two main problems, and to come back to your question, I would say that there is still a chance. What could work? For example, I think Mr. Ahmad already mentioned in his presentation that not only Islam, but Abrahamic religions has a direct connection between climate change and the protection of the earth. These shared values can be invested to encourage young people, to encourage individuals, to encourage every single believer in these religions to actually adopt or follow eco-friendly practices in a daily life. The second thing is these institutions actually enjoying a huge network of mosques, churches. For example, in Egypt, we have mosques and churches covering every single part of the country, which is something that other authorities, for example, Ministry of Youth or whatever, are not enjoying the same network of these buildings. These buildings can serve as insightful places to massively promote and to raise awareness about the climate change and the eco-friendly practices that citizens, believers, human beings can actually follow. One more thing is these institutions that I mentioned, we always used to say that we need to advocate for friendly policies from policy or governmental organizations. We used to say that we need to invite and encourage private sector to follow the same, but also these religious institutions need to promote sustainable and to encourage sustainable policies in these in the buildings that belonging to them by promoting energy efficiency, waste reduction, and responsible resources consumption in order to mitigate the impact of climate change and climate emergencies. I'm afraid to be out of time, still a lot to say, but I want to give a chance to my colleague to continue.
I'm going to invite Mickey.
Hi, everyone, and greetings from Cameroon. It's afternoon here, so good afternoon from my end. Good morning, good evening to all from wherever you're joining from. And happy Mother's Day in advance to all the beautiful mothers in the house. Before I share about what works as a local youth climate change actor and peace builder, I would like to first of all highlight the fact that being a youth is already a factor. It's one of the encouraging aspects we have: our youthfulness, our agility, our strength, our willingness to contribute to change, our willingness to support. One thing that I think works best right now for me, practically working in the grassroots in Cameroon, and also serving on different platforms and networks, both in Africa and across the globe, is the support that we have for each other as young people. It's important to note that we try to bring our efforts together, support each other. And one of the things that I've seen worked well is also through what the Faith for Our Planet did recently in January, that brought us together from across the globe. It contributes to the factors or the efforts that young people are bringing. A lot of young people have initiative, have hopes, have willingness to contribute to the climate challenges and to work with actors. And one thing that helps us most is our solidarity. It's our willingness to work together, because one of the challenges we face is access to resources, to decision makers. But because of this support that we have for each other, it is even easier for us to move to access people from different communities. For instance, if I want to meet a priest in Bamenda and I'm not in Bamenda, I have to just reach out to a young person in Bamenda in Cameroon that I know or work with, and then they make a way. This is easier than if I have to start using bureaucratic processes of writing the letter and dropping off at the priest's office, or sharing my idea to him through informal methods or formal methods. Sorry for background noise. I'm actually at home today. It's Monday in Cameroon, and in the English regions of Cameroon, we have ghost towns. So everybody's indoors. We can't go out because of conflict. In the past, people used to ask me, what is ghost town? Then when COVID came, I was able to tell them what ghost town was. I was like, it's lockdown. So because of COVID, we couldn't leave our homes. So every Mondays in Cameroon, in the English regions, we can't leave our homes because of the crisis. So I'm working from home today. So young people need support. And that's one thing that we also do not have. I don't know if I'm going too fast to the challenges because they're all interconnected. Because the fact that we want to support each other as youth, we don't have the resources. I may want to support my fellow youth in the initiative they are doing, and then I need to make a financial support or be present physically, and it requires finances. It requires me to be present, push their ideology or push their programs or activities. So there's lack of resources, but then our willingness to do that even beyond what we can bring on the table. Like I was saying, for instance, one of the things that I've seen work too is building alliances, building friendships. Being one who is working in the interfaith aspect of work, I've worked a lot with different faith leaders, from the Catholic, Presbyterian, Baptist, Muslim, and even just people who are not really connected to any faith or Pentecostal, because of the relationships I built with them. One reason I speak of relationship is because these relationships just spiritual relationships, which means we meet at different places where we can talk about societal problems, and then we build connections. We meet at workshops, we meet at consultative meetings, we meet at activities like humanitarian assistance programs, and then we build these relationships and friendships, and it's easy to access them when we have to work with them for activities. It is true this that they're able to give us spaces in their churches, because Dennis Mickey Foundation in the past and currently, when we do activities, we go to churches to pass on our messages. We request for 5 or 10 minutes during the service time to speak to the population. Sometimes if we cannot get the time to speak to the population directly, we can meet their groups, for instance, the youth groups, the women's groups in the churches, and then educate them on climate change, on faith actions and their roles as community leaders in supporting each other in climate mitigation. So one of this has really been very successful because of the relationships, like I said, building friendships, because if we have to follow normal bureaucratic procedures, we would be dealing with things like going to deposit letters for requests of time, and it takes a lot of time. But when we have relationships, it's easier to bypass these bureaucratic processes. And once we use religious platforms, we get access to community members that we could not reach on a regular basis. Because, for instance, here in Cameroon, the way it works is every Sunday people gather together in church. So when they're in church, they come from different communities, different homes, different backgrounds, and sending out a message during just that service. Sometimes it's letters that we send and it's read during the service. It takes the information to as many people as we can get, which is better than if we have to start mobilizing resources to bring people together for workshops, because sometimes the challenge is mobilizing the resources to bring them to one place. So we have been using cost-effective methods to get the message out, using media, local radio. We have a lot of them being part of our communities here at Dennis Mickey Foundation. We use WhatsApp as well. We have a general group called the Dennis Mickey Foundation WhatsApp group, where we put people we work together on that platform, share information, and reach out to them for opportunities. So I would end here so that there's time for Braden and the others to share.
Thank you very much, Emily, for your sharing your experience towards addressing climate emergency in your community.
Brian, do you want to answer the first panel question? So as young leaders addressing climate emergencies in your community, have you found there are unique opportunities in working with faith actors and communities to address conflicts? What seems to work and not work in your experience?
Okay, so what works in our context here in the Philippines? So I'm also like a youth leader at church. So first and foremost, what doesn't work when speaking with the faith-based organization introducing about climate change or peace and security is that you insist your own agenda. First, you should know first their context. Like you ask what is happening on the ground, what are the challenges? Like you need to listen. You need to listen of what are they having in their community, because your agenda or your solutions might not meet the agenda of the community that you are having or the organization that you're interacting with. And with that, it might create a conflict if you want to like pursue your own agenda, your own solution. So first, for me, I always do a background research of the organization or the community that I want to delve into to talk about climate change or youth, peace, and security agenda. So that for me works a lot because it avoids conflict, it avoids chaos, and it avoids miscommunication with the community.
Thank you, Brian. So I'll go to the second round of questions, and starting with you, Yusuf, about what concrete solution do you feel is not getting enough attention or support to address conflicts in your community caused by climate emergencies? And what can faith actors do to support this solution?
Thank you, Jessica. Actually, this question would remind me to come back like 7 years ago. It was obvious that the relationships between religious institutions among countries was almost not there. Recently, there is a very important document signed called the Human Fraternity Document, which is a joint statement signed by two religious elders, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, the first reference for Muslims worldwide in Egypt, and Pope Francis, the Pope of Vatican. Actually, that was a very significant step towards the religious diplomacy that I would suggest that we really need to rely on it and to replicate its role. Religious institutions can lead an international movement together because diplomacy has different actors. So we need our religious institutions like Al-Azhar, Canterbury in the UK, Vatican, other organizations all over the world to create like an alliance, to invest in their relationships, to invest in their influence on policymakers, on citizens to lead this movement, so they can actually promote dialogue, cooperation between communities, policymakers, their own religious institutions, so we can like create an alliance to combat climate change. So this is my own point in this regard.
Thank you, Yusuf. I go to you, Emily. Same question.
Thanks, Jess. So for me, I think, given that we have a lot of faith leaders here, I was thinking, especially when Shiraz was sharing his presentation earlier today about the work FFOP is doing and planning to do, is if we can do more training of trainers kind of sessions with religious leaders at grassroots levels as well, which means we need resources to do this, because the work we do is amazing, but we need to bring more of them together to be kind of like supporters, to be advocates and ambassadors of this work we're doing, because they have already access to communities. Faith leaders are leaders who have access to community members who believe in them, because the way religion is, they are kind of like the representative of the God figure of whichever religion we are working or talking about. So if we can really work with them as allies, which means bringing more of them into know of what is happening, because right now at the grassroots level, a lot of them are not aware of what we are doing as movement building efforts, as know-how or think tanks efforts, research. So if we can involve them in research processes, if we can involve them in grassroots mobilizing efforts, because they already are one of the best people we can work with in mobilizing grassroots members. So we need resources to do more. So I don't know what engagements we're taking as we continue with this monthly sessions, Peacemakers Network and FFOP. Let me put it to you too, because you are the kind of like the bosses in this platform, is how do we mobilize resources? How do we raise the resources to do more in our community, starting from the grassroots? Because, you know, grassroots mobilization is key. We have to always start from the grassroots to the national, to the international, because policies, wherever they are signed in the international or national, must always be implemented back at the grassroots. So if the grassroots is not involved from the beginning, then there's always that gap where when we have to come back with localizing processes, then there's denial or there is non-acceptance and all of that. So if we can start working with faith actors, because a lot of them are willing, but then they don't have the know-how. And for instance, like sessions like this today, with the tool that was already shared, the one that FFOP is currently working on, those are things that we can take back to the communities to work with them, to build their capacities through TOT programs and workshops and training sessions, where they can take this and go back to their churches, their religious gatherings, and use it as a tool to train their community members. Because one thing with climate change and also its connection to peace is that the effect when it happens is worse than if we mitigate. So if we can start using mitigation methods or preventive methods now, then it's better. For instance, in Cameroon, where during the rainy seasons, we have a lot of floods and people die and homes are destroyed. If the church leaders can start talking to their community members that don't build along water pathways, it's already an educative measure. And if there are no tools for them to use, then it becomes difficult. So we need to build synergy, work together more, and also document, like I heard you say earlier when think I missed her name from Uganda, was sharing, that we need to document best practices on unsung heroes, because some of these leaders are also unsung heroes. We are not documenting their experiences or their efforts in leading these processes. So it's good for us to build synergy and document processes, make it something that can be used as we also push for monitoring, evaluation, and learning.
Thanks, Emily. And last but not least, Brian.
Since I'm also working at the government side, I work at the Climate Change Commission, just for the context of everyone. So we always believe of a whole of government and a whole of society of approach. So because it is the lives, livelihoods, and the future generations are at stake of the impacts of climate change. And also like the impacts of climate change is very devastating here in the Philippines, as we are the most vulnerable country according to World Risk Report 2022, since we receive like 30 typhoons in 1 year. So just imagine, we receive 2 typhoons in every month. So there's an issue of displacement when there is a typhoon hitting a certain community. So there is a chaos, there is a gap between the government and the community. It's because the community is not waiting for the action of the government to give some relief goods for them. So the unfortunate events are those looting events. There are robbery everywhere. So it's very chaotic when there is a typhoon or the impacts of the climate change, like for example, sea level rise. It's because it affects the peace of a community. So going back to the question, the faith-based organization or the faith-based leaders can bridge the gap by making concrete actions. Like for example, if there is a climate emergency or there is a typhoon, there is a community hit by a typhoon, then it is their initiative. So fortunately, here in the Philippines, we have, even if we have different denominations in our country, we bond together, we stick together. So when a certain community is being hit by a typhoon, we help them instantly. We don't rely more, like we don't wait for the government to take action. So the faith-based organization or the churches make certain actions to solve the problem. In that way, it can bridge the gap between the community and the state. Because fortunately here in the Philippines, like they believe that addressing climate change is not just a solution of, problems to be solved by scientists or by politicians, but it also includes the people of faith. So that is why, fortunately, in the context here in the Philippines, they don't wait for the government to take action. They take initiatives to bridge the gap between the community and the government.
No, I think that's a very important point to end on, as being connectors of everybody in this room, being connectors in their local communities, and the need to actually get things done, right? We're not waiting for it to come to us. Gideon, I see your hands raised.
Just a contribution regarding what I do in Ghana, right? I'm from Ghana, and in my organization, we have made efforts in making sure that parties that engage in indiscriminate, disposal of waste are made to face the full force of law. And we have campaigned against the illegal mining, what in Ghana we locally see galamsey, and so because we know that illegal mining is also affecting the climate change. And apart from that, we've made efforts to also remind government that there's this mineral in Ghana called lithium that could assist in a fight against climate change internationally. Of course, you know that currently production of automobiles, there's this campaign that yes, the automobile should be manufactured with a notion that it should be electronic, and not the old type of vehicles that we have. And so Ghana seems to have this mineral called lithium, which can help in the production of electric vehicles. And so in our own small way in Ghana, we are doing so much to ensure that climate is respected, because we know repercussions of not respecting the climate and how it can affect us people.
I think that's a really important point. And actually, we had Imam Bashir, who was telling us about that in the Faith for Our Planet initiative. He's doing a lot to address the mining in Ghana. And I thank you for raising that important point. Any other reflections or questions before we go out into the breakout rooms?
I see one nice one in the chat from Kurt Palar, Jess, about starting early and doing this advocacy or environmental education at schools or monasteries or future religious leaders, which is quite good. I just wanted to highlight it.
That's a really good point. And now we're starting to see more and more young religious leaders as well. Zihan.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I want to know from this panel talking the whole session, sometimes when you go towards religious leaders, they are not even, if in our culture, like in the Pakistan, being a Muslim, the religious leaders are so extremist or at an extreme level, they are not willing to listen something, and they consider it, and they have very strong and the magical power so that they can convince people. And even based on the basis of the misconceptions, superstitions, and all these things, people believe them so much. And in this condition, and it is very difficult to engage them. Somehow, let's suppose, if you can engage them, then out of 100%, only 2 to 3% will join you, because due to this digital era, right? And I want to know that how it is some very challenging problem, right? They are considering it as a natural disaster, like the climate justice and suffering also from their families and all these things. And how you can bring these things closer to each other, how you can bring all these religious networks, you can bring your allies together. That is somehow when you are starting a social venture, you have to face a lot of challenges. But a person standing at the top extreme, it's very challenging to bring these people on one point. And regardless if you want to give something on the basis of as a philanthropist, that they will accept.
Thank you. I think actually this would be interesting to hear from two different perspectives. So one, Brian, do you want to speak from your perspective as a young person in addressing, some of these power dynamics and managing up?
Exactly. Like, I'm smiling. It's because it has happened to me, especially here in the Philippines. Like, we also have like Muslim brothers and sisters. So what I'm seeing here as a solution is that first, you tell stories, or you get a Muslim or go to a certain community that has been like impacted by the impacts of climate change. Like, for example, like you make that community as an example. If it doesn't work, then you get a certain Muslim brother or sister that is very influential. You teach him or her about the science of climate change, laymanize it. It's not an easy task. It's a long process. It's because you need to build first the connection. So if you don't have any connections to your community, talking about climate change, talking about peace and security, then I think it must first come from you, doing just small actions in your community just to showcase to them that these are the impacts of what you have been doing. In that case, you will grow bigger and bigger. So first, tell stories, personal experiences of the impacts of climate change, or if you don't have one, then you get a community. And then third and lastly, you educate a certain brother or sister about climate change. And so you yourself, you need to be prepared. You need to be like knowledgeably ready and emotionally ready, because it's a very long process to go.
Shiraz, can you provide your perspective on how you've been tackling this?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a big topic, right? How do you deal with faith-based climate skeptics? We are talking about Muslim communities, I think, in this instance, but actually it's a problem that we see in a lot of faith communities, this narrative of predestiny and almost fatalism. God has written this, Allah has a plan, or Jesus has a plan, or God has a plan, and therefore climate change is not man-made. It is part of a bigger cosmic plan. In our experience, this is where religious scriptural reasoning is really, really powerful and essential, really. One of our initiatives probably beginning towards the end of this year and across most of next year, will be a climate communications campaign in the US targeting faith-based climate skeptics in the US. Evangelical communities tend to have a disproportionate impact on the climate debate in policy terms and also culturally. So how do we deal with that? I think there are a couple of really good points that Brian's raised. One is about about narratives and storytelling, about humanizing the issue of climate change. I think the topic of this conversation, or the framing of it, this event, is really important and notable. Conflict. It isn't about science or about data and numbers. It's about lives, right? It's about what's happening to us. It's about health. It's about conflict. It's about food, floods in Pakistan. So there's a way of making the reality of our environment. So let's just get away from climate science, data, IPCC reports, all of that for a moment. We focus on what's happening in the world. There's so much that's just undeniable, and that's one of the routes through which we envisage engaging some evangelical communities and leaders who perhaps are skeptical about the man-made nature of climate change, but cannot dispute that environmental disasters are taking place. There's an increased frequency of floods, typhoons, earthquakes. What do we do about that? How do we deal with that? And so I think there's something to be said about building trust and having at some base level, some sort of unifying values-driven concepts that we can all get around. As FFLP, by the way, we're very lucky because our seed partner is the Muslim World League. They're based in Makkah. They have a network of 1,200 senior Islamic scholars around the world in 139 countries. So they come with a lot of that gravitas religiously. It's also very, very important. One of the strategies we're utilizing is we are bringing senior members of the global religious community, say from Europe, from a certain part of the world, and having them speak to their religious colleagues and compatriots in other parts of the world, so that they're using the same language, they're coming from the same space at a spiritual or in a values-based sense. That's also very, very powerful. As Brian was saying, getting an initial foothold within that community by winning some people over. And one way to do that is bringing faith leaders from other parts of the world to speak to their religious colleagues elsewhere. There isn't always as straightforward as it sounds. There are local differences. There are a lot of other differences, but that might be one way to get that ball rolling. So those are a couple of the ways. Another way that I think is really powerful, and one of the speakers mentioned this, I think it might have been Yusuf earlier on, but this idea about greenifying religious spaces, I think, is very notable, not just because of the environmental or carbon footprint of that particular mosque or church, but because it has huge symbolic power. People that come in and out of those places of worship, they learn something from that experience without you having to lecture them about it, right? They're taking away a culture of environmental sustainability because it's been built into the religious space. And actually, when we were doing a workshop in Pakistan, we went to the King Faisal Masjid in Islamabad, very environmentally sound. They don't use air conditioning. It's architecturally designed for air to flow in and out in a way that doesn't consume as many resources as another masjid might. These are interesting examples. Again, scriptural reasoning, looking at the example of the Prophet, looking at biblical text, is very important, number one. So just going back to that, scriptural reasoning is super powerful. I think number two, humanizing the narrative, taking it away from the politics and divisiveness and making it about people, about bread and butter issues. And finally, and I'm sure there are lots of other points to add, but the symbolic power of greenifying faith spaces. I feel that's a hidden gem that can really have a huge impact in the way children, as they grow up, begin to perceive their connection to their faith through environmental and a sustainability lens.
Thank you, Shiraz. And I know we could continue diving even deeper into this discussion, but I want to make sure that everyone has enough time to be able to add to the discussion. So we're going to go out into the breakout rooms. So I will see you all in the breakout rooms. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So we'll do a quick readout to hear what the discussions that were taking place in the different rooms. So I will start with room one, whether Imam, Bashir, or Yuta, whoever wanted to give the readout.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think we had an interesting discussion and lots of good sharings. And for the first questions, we were talking about the instability and issues that come out from the climate insecurity that causes conflicts, and the lack of resources was the main issue, usually causing conflicts and grievances. And maybe the solutions that came up, at least some of those, please, Emily or any other, you can fill in if I missed something essential. But what was highlighted were the bottom-up approaches, and including the communities in the solutions, using community solutions to the community problems. Those were at least highlighted. The climate mitigation measures that should take place, for instance, planting these forests to avoid the hostilities and so forth.
And maybe just to add, there was a best practice that was shared, which was the peacemaking circles, where community members would come together in circles and share their grievances for common solutions. And then also the organization of sports bonanza, where these platforms were used to raise awareness. This was shared by Abel. And one of the challenges that really came up to was lack of government support. So that was something that popped up. Yeah.
Thank you, Group 1, and thank you, Emily, for jumping in. Group 2, Ananda and Kapila.
Thank you, Jessica. Jisan mentioned about the cultivation of the forest, and then the research also shows that the mature tree provides only the 10 kg per year. We need to focus furthermore about the clean energy, and then also there are some kind of conflict induced because of the deforestation, and then people are also lost their lives, and people are becoming homeless in Pakistan. That's why we also need to focus to engage the youth people and also for the forest. To stop the deforestation related activities. And he also focused for the clean energy, and then to independent for the power plant. So financial problem is also the another issues, and then so that is also kind of problem, so that we also need to focus for those availability. And next one is about they are working for the movement in women, women. They are basically work for the women movement and also the land rights and property ownership. They have also the network of those community meeting, and then they have their objective to empower the women. From Sanat, at the end, he was focusing for basically the financial related things, as well as the empowerment or engagement, those kind of words, but I'm not able to hear Sanat. You can also edit it there. And one of our participants, Fiona, so they are also focusing for the capacity of young leaders and then marginalized youth. And they are also engaged for the capacity to build the resilience and the environment. And they are also providing some training and research and advocacy. And they are also working with the different local partners as well. Anand, you may include more.
So Sonata just focusing on the livelihood and the global warming, and that's create the conflict in the Bangladeshi context. So climate change impact on the community, on their livelihood. So tremendously changes the indigenous community and others communities, the livelihood, and that's induced the climate change conflict among the community. And that's the part to how to the climate change activists are working for ensuring the justice for the both and the indigenous community as well as the others people also.
Thank you, Group 2. Group 3, Braden and Tritz.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm happy to report back some highlights. So what our group kind of discussed within the first question, like issues around environmental stress. A lot of our group members mentioned that there are not enough resources, but also like within context-based Myanmar, for example, they are a very resource-rich country. So there's a lot of conflict within there. And then also there's a lot of like deforestation and flooding. And then also within rural areas, very hard hit. So sometimes there's like unsustainable farming techniques. So that kind of like produces pollution within the soil. So that's not very sustainable for the future. And then to address some of these issues in collaboration with faith actors, a lot of our group members mentioned it is important to reach out to younger religious leaders and to build connections, but also to introduce the education of climate emergencies to certain communities, continuing to reach out to community leaders and faith leaders to have them act and educate their own communities.
Thanks, Tris. And then last but not least, the last group, Catherine and Kirtu.
Yes, happy to go first, and then Catherine can add. So regarding the discussion in the group and the first question, there are so many environmental hazards that are causing environmental stress and conflicts in the communities. And it was very well put by one of the participants that climate change affects especially women. And women are the frontliners on climate change because they are working in care, taking care of the family members, as well as farming and bringing water. So this was excellent point. It was agreed in the group that it's important to combine, for example, CSO programming efforts and combine the peace and climate change in programming, as well as do the work for climate and peace together with the faith communities and faith leaders. There were some practical examples what have been done. For example, in Cameroon, there is an organization who hosts this kind of climate change clubs in schools. These are really important because they can change the mindset of youth, educate them about relevant matters such as recycling and, for example, promoting greenhouses. And it was also pointed out that, as in this example, the school children, they are in a Christian school, if I understood together, so they can easily have access to the faith-based communities and the faith-based leaders, and this creates some kind of cooperation synergy that helps to take the matters further. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirtu. And thanks to everyone who participated in the breakouts and to our facilitators and our speakers today that gave us such a rich conversation. And now we have some key examples and takeaways of how we can address some of the faith-based climate skeptics, and also some practical next steps in terms of trainings that are available, consultations that are available to be able to keep our work going. Just to say that our next meeting will take place on Wednesday, July 12th, during the UN High-Level Political Forum, and we'll focus on synergizing partnerships between and funding opportunities between the women and youth peace and security agendas. So if you work in either the women and youth peace and security spaces, which most of you do, and you want to look to how we synergize those movements, we'll see you on July 12th. So without further ado, thanks everybody again for such a great meeting, and looking forward to seeing you soon.